2 o'clock in the morning, and the Harborside Diner in Baltimore had gone quiet except for the crackle of grease in the kitchen and the rain drumming on the tin roof. Josephine Calloway, 27 years old, was working her fourth night shift of the week on feet that had stopped feeling anything hours ago, wiping down tables out of pure habit, too tired to think about anything but the rent notice folded in her coat pocket. 2 years ago, she had been a shift manager at an upscale restaurant downtown, until the night she dared to say out loud what she had seen in that kitchen. And they answered her with one word: thief. That word had followed her into every place she had asked for work ever since. In the far corner, the man was there again. 5 nights in a row. Always the same seat. Always the same cup of black coffee that he never once lifted to his lips. A dark coat, a thin scar running along his jaw, and gray eyes sunk deep and threaded with red. The eyes of someone who had gone a very long time without a decent hour of sleep. Josie brought him the check, and just as she leaned down to wipe the table, he spoke, slowly, as calmly as a man remarking on the weather. "Sleep with me. I'll pay any price." She straightened up, her hand tightening around the rag, her heart beating in her throat. "You've got the wrong woman." He didn't get angry, and he didn't explain. He only looked at her a moment longer than necessary, the look of a man gambling the last thing he had left. That night, Josie went home and couldn't sleep at all, because she still didn't know who she had just turned down, and she had no idea that those words did not mean the thing she had spent her whole life afraid of. If this story touched your heart, leave a like so we know you're still listening, send it to someone you think needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the stories still to come. The following night, Josie had barely hung her coat on the hook when the owner was already waiting at the kitchen door. Without saying a word, the woman merely tilted her head, signaling for Josie to come inside. She closed the door and lowered her voice until Josie had to lean closer to hear, then told her who the man seated in the farthest corner for the past 5 nights really was. Emmett Rourke. She said the name only once, very quickly, as though speaking it any longer would cause it to cling to her tongue. The stack of plates in Josie's hands slipped onto the steel table, 2 of them shattered, and she stood staring at the broken pieces without bending down to gather them. It wasn't the name that made her hands tremble. In the Harbor District, people didn't speak that name aloud in crowded places. They said it by lowering their voices, just as the owner had done, and everyone who conducted business there understood that every crate passing through the docks, every permit, and every loan made without paperwork passed through that man's hands before reaching anyone else. The owner told Josie to take 3 nights off and wait for the matter to settle down. She would arrange for Josie to make up the hours on the morning shift. Josie shook her head. 3 nights meant $48 in wages and tips, and $48 was exactly 1/3 of Wade's monthly therapy costs. She thanked the woman, bent down to collect the broken pieces, then asked only one question. Had the storage room door been closed the previous night? The owner frowned and said it had been left slightly open, as it was every night, so the boy wouldn't be afraid of the dark. Josie nodded and asked nothing more, but throughout that night's shift, she kept looking toward the table in the farthest corner, the table against the wall, exactly an arm's length from the storage room door. Night after night, Wade had slept in that storage room during her shifts, ever since she had taken this job. Josie couldn't afford anyone to watch her brother, and there was no one with whom she could leave him. So the owner had placed a bench against the wall for the boy, and covered it with an old blanket. Every evening before going out to wait tables, Josie sat on the edge of that bench and read him several pages, until his eyes began to close. No one in the diner minded. The owner even saved him the pieces of bread, with the burnt edges he liked. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Josie locked the diner, carried Wade onto the final bus, and then the 2 of them climbed 3 flights of stairs to their rented room. The boy fell asleep over his notebook again almost as soon as he sat at the table, the tip of his pencil still pressed against the paper, a word left half-written. Wade hadn't spoken in 4 years. He wrote everything in that notebook, from the stray cat behind the diner to the fact that his sister had come home 10 minutes later than usual that day. Josie gently removed the pencil from his hand, and when she looked up, she saw what lay across the table. The notice informing her that the rent would increase by $90 a month beginning the following month. The speech therapy bill, now 2 payments overdue, with a line in bold print warning that his appointments would be canceled if it wasn't paid, and a thin envelope containing a response from the 9th place where she had applied for work that month. 3 polite lines offering no reason, though she had read those same 3 lines 9 times and knew exactly what the reason was. Josie stacked all 3 papers together, turned them face down, then rose and took the book from the shelf. It had a blue cover, a worn spine, and one corner rubbed white by hands that had turned its pages for too many years. Her finger moved slowly along the lining of the spine, once from end to end, then stopped at a place slightly thicker than the rest. She held it there for several seconds. Then she opened the book, pulled her chair close to where her brother lay sleeping, and began to read aloud, her voice rough after 8 hours of waiting tables, reading to a sleeping child as she did every night. Outside, the rain still hadn't stopped, and somewhere in that city, there was a man who had spent 5 nights sitting exactly an arm's length from that partially open door, and that night, he wasn't sleeping either. He didn't return for the next 2 nights, and Josie told herself that it was over, that a man like him wouldn't come back to a diner by the harbor merely because a waitress had told him no. On the 8th night, she carried a tray out of the kitchen and saw someone seated at the table in the farthest corner, the same dark coat, the same cup of black coffee he hadn't touched. She stopped behind the counter for exactly 1 beat, then picked up the coffee pot, walked over, set it on the table, and said nothing. Emmett Rourke looked at the pot, then at her. He told her to sit down, and when Josie didn't move, he added that this would take roughly 3 minutes, that she could remain standing if she preferred, but he advised her to sit. She pulled out the chair, perched on its edge, and placed both hands on her knees. He began immediately, without an introduction or an apology, his voice as slow and even as it had been the first night. He said that he had said something terrible that night, not because it had been wrong according to what he meant, but because it had been perfectly clear in the way any woman would have understood it. He hadn't considered that, because for 3 years, he hadn't been capable of thinking properly about anything. Then he explained exactly what he had meant. He wasn't talking about taking her to bed. He wanted to sleep. He meant sleep in the most literal sense of the word. Closing his eyes and not waking again after 40 minutes, remaining asleep through an entire night, like every ordinary person in the world seemed able to do without paying anyone for it. He hadn't managed to do that in 3 years. Josie sat motionless. She had intended to say something firm, something like, "What does that have to do with me?" But she couldn't say it because she was looking at his hands resting on the table and noticing how still they were, unnaturally still, with the stillness of someone too exhausted to move anymore. Then he said something that sent a chill down her spine. He asked whether she remembered the 3rd night. She didn't. He did. He said that at roughly 1:45 that night, she had gone into the storage room in the back, sat on the edge of the bench, and read to a child for perhaps 15 or 20 minutes. The storage room door had been left open by about the width of a hand. He had been sitting exactly an arm's length from that opening. He had heard every word. He said he hadn't meant to listen and hadn't understood what was happening. He only knew that his eyelids had grown heavy, and when he opened his eyes again, the hands of the clock had moved forward 20 minutes. The coffee before him had gone cold, and during those 20 minutes, he hadn't dreamed, startled awake, or awakened halfway through. He said those 20 minutes had been his first real sleep in 3 years. Josie opened her mouth, then closed it again. At that moment, there was only one small and absurd image in her mind. The narrow opening the owner left in the storage room door every night, so Wade wouldn't be afraid of the dark. The same opening Josie had passed night after night without ever giving it a single thought. He continued in the same calm voice, saying he wasn't a man who easily believed in things like that. So over the following 6 nights, he had tested it. Recordings, he said, audiobooks, male voices, female voices, professional narrators, played across the room, directly beside his ear, throughout the entire night. Medication of every kind, some that rendered him unconscious rather than putting him to sleep, some that did nothing but leave a bitter taste in his mouth until morning. The finest doctors in the country, people others waited half a year to see, had shone lights into his head, attached wires all over his body, shaken their heads, and written one more prescription. He said he had tried everything, and none of it had accomplished what she had done for 20 minutes in a diner by the harbor, through a partially open door, without even knowing she was doing it. Then he fell silent. He didn't plead. He didn't push money across the table as he had on the first night. He merely sat there and looked at her, and it was that calmness that frightened Josie, because she suddenly understood that this man wasn't begging. He was presenting his findings. He had spent 6 nights calculating, eliminating every other possibility one at a time, and now only one possibility remained. Seated before him in an apron, her hands still carrying the smell of dish soap, she heard herself ask, more quietly than she had expected, what he wanted from her. His voice didn't change at all when he said that he wanted to hire her reading voice. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat, withdrew a stack of money, and placed it in the middle of the table. He didn't push it toward her. He merely set it down, then named an amount for 3 months. The figure was greater than everything Josie had earned over the past 2 years combined. And for one brief beat, she saw everything it could buy. The rent, Wade's 2 overdue therapy payments, the entire following year as well. Then she reached out and pushed the stack back toward him, stopping it in the middle of the table, exactly where he had placed it. He looked at her hand, then raised his eyes to her. "Is it too little?" "No," she said. "Then what is it?" "Because if I take this now, I become someone you have bought," she said, "and I will never be able to disagree with you again." He said nothing. Josie drew a breath, then said she would accept, but on her terms. She had 4 conditions, and if he dismissed even one of them, the entire agreement was over. He folded his hands on the table and told her to speak. "First, my brother comes with me. He is 10 years old. I sleep wherever he sleeps, and he attends school and therapy according to his regular schedule. None of that changes." Emmett nodded. "Agreed." "Second, I have my own room with a lock, and I keep the key. You never cross that threshold. Not once. Whether you are awake, whether you are not awake, or whether your people decide it is necessary." He remained silent 1 beat longer than he had after the first condition, then nodded. "Agreed." "Third, I don't belong to anyone. I am not an employee in your house, and I am not something you arrange into some place in your life. I come, I read, and I return to my room. On any day I choose to leave, I leave. I don't have to explain myself to you, or to anyone who works for you. You will not keep me there by any means." He studied her for longer, then said, "Agreed." And this time, he spoke more slowly than the previous 3 times. "And the 4th condition," she said, hearing her voice grow steadier. "I don't want to know how you make your living." One of his eyebrows lifted slightly. She continued without pausing. "People have already told me your name. I have worked in this harbor district long enough to know how things work. I am not naive, but I won't ask, and you mustn't tell me. Whatever happens beyond the doors of your house stays outside them. I am selling you my reading voice, Mr. Rourke. Nothing more." The only sounds remaining in the diner were the grease sizzling in the kitchen and a truck passing along the street outside. He didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the stack of money still resting in the middle of the table, picked it up, and returned it to the inner pocket of his coat. Josie felt her heart drop because she thought the agreement had fallen apart. But he didn't stand. He said he accepted all 4 conditions, then added that she would be paid weekly, directly into her hand, never in advance, so she could stop whenever she wished. And if she stopped, the money she had already earned would remain hers. Then, in the same level voice he had used from the beginning, he said she was the first person in many years who had dared set conditions with him. Josie asked what everyone else did. He said they only asked him what he wanted. She didn't know how to answer that, so she asked something else. "What happens if I read and you still can't sleep?" He said she would still be paid in full. She told him she wasn't asking about the money. He was silent for a moment, then said that if it failed, he still wouldn't have lost anything more, because he had been at the bottom of this for 3 years, and a man standing at the bottom couldn't fall any farther. It was the only sentence he spoke that entire evening in which his voice shifted even slightly. Josie rose, removed her apron, folded it, and placed it over the back of the chair. "Give me 2 days. I need to tell the owner and rearrange the boy's schedule." He agreed. Then he asked the child's name. "Wade," she said. "Wade Calloway." He nodded, committing the name to memory as someone might memorize a term in a contract, then stood and left behind the cup of black coffee, untouched just as it had been throughout the previous 8 nights. 2 days later, a black car stopped outside the old building, and Josie came down 3 flights of stairs carrying a suitcase, Wade's backpack, and the blue-covered book tucked beneath her arm. The diner owner had cried a little when Josie told her she was leaving, then pressed an entire bag of bread with burnt edges into the boy's hands. In the car, Wade sat close to the window with his notebook open on his lap, writing constantly throughout the journey as though he were afraid he might forget something. The car followed the water before turning onto a road without a name sign. The house stood directly on the shore, low and wide, with glass walls running along one entire side overlooking the harbor. When Josie stepped inside, the first thing she noticed wasn't its size, but that not one framed photograph hung on any of those walls. An older man with closely cut silver hair and shoulders, still broad enough to belong to someone who had spent his life loading cargo, came out to meet them. He introduced himself as Otis Brannigan. He looked Josie up and down without concealing it, with the gaze of a man whose duty was to evaluate everything that entered that house, then asked her directly whether she understood where she was walking into. Josie said she knew enough not to ask any more questions. Otis nodded once, and she had the feeling that her answer had just carried her through some unseen gate. Then he bent until he was level with Wade, extended his hand, and when the boy said nothing but lifted his notebook and wrote a single word of greeting, Otis showed no surprise. He simply read the word and shook Wade's hand with the seriousness he would have offered an adult. Josie felt something tighten in her throat. Otis led them along the hallway, showed her Wade's room, then her own room directly beside it, and handed her the key without making her ask. At the end of the hallway, a woman stood leaning against the frame of the study door, a thin file in one hand. Emmett stopped, and the woman straightened, smiled, and introduced herself as Sloane Rayner, Mr. Rourke's personal attorney. Then she told Josie she was very glad someone had finally arrived, and her voice held exactly the proper measure of warmth, without one unnecessary word. Josie thanked her. Emmett asked Sloane about some documents from the docks. She answered concisely. Then he nodded and turned toward the study. Sloane held her smile until he disappeared behind the door. Then she took a phone from her pocket, retreated into the shadows at the end of the hallway, turned her back, and spoke very quietly. That was all Josie saw before Otis called to her, and she continued down the hall. That night, Wade fell asleep at 9 o'clock, still curled inside the old blanket they had brought from home, and Josie remained seated on the edge of his bed longer than necessary. At 11 o'clock, she knocked on Emmett's bedroom door. He was already lying on the bed, still wearing his shirt, both arms resting straight beside him, his open eyes fixed on the ceiling. He didn't turn toward her when she entered. Josie pulled an armchair to a place roughly 10 feet from the bed, the precise distance she had already chosen in her mind, sat down, opened the blue-covered book, and began to read. She started at the beginning without asking what part he wanted to hear, and she read exactly as she always read to Wade, without performing, without lowering her voice for effect, simply reading. 1 hour passed. His eyes remained open. Then 2 hours. She could hear the water outside the harbor striking the wooden pilings. At one point, her throat grew so dry that she had to stop and swallow, and the moment she paused, he shifted slightly, so she continued. By 3 o'clock in the morning, her voice had become completely hoarse, her eyes were burning, and she began to think that perhaps those 20 minutes in the diner had been nothing but a coincidence, that this man had paid for something that didn't exist. She kept reading. At 3:40 in the morning, she turned to a new page and had read half a sentence when she stopped. Something in the room had changed. She raised her head. His hands had relaxed at his sides. His jaw was no longer clenched, and his breathing, which for the past 4 hours had remained shallow, and even with a kind of strained control, had deepened and slowed into the breathing of someone truly asleep. Josie sat perfectly still with the book open on her lap, afraid to move, afraid even to breathe too loudly, and she remained that way for a very long time, watching the man whose name the entire harbor district spoke only in lowered voices sleep. The next morning, Emmett woke close to 9 o'clock, and when he entered the kitchen, he stopped in the doorway for a long moment, like a man who had stepped into a day without remembering how it had begun. He said nothing about what had happened, and Josie didn't ask. But she was someone who had spent countless long nights working shifts in a diner, and before that, years in the kitchen of a restaurant where everything had to happen for a reason, so she didn't believe in events without causes. On the second night, she entered his room at exactly 11 o'clock and placed the chair in the same spot, but she didn't open the book. She rested it face down on her lap and sat in silence. She wanted to know whether her presence alone was enough. He didn't ask why she wasn't reading. He lay still with his eyes open and changed position every half hour. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he sat up, walked to the glass door, and stood looking toward the harbor for a very long time before returning to bed. 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock. Daylight slowly spread across the water, and he was still awake, while Josie remained in the chair with the book face down on her lap, knowing she had just taken an entire night from him. She apologized. He said it was all right, his voice raw and hoarse, and she found those words harder to hear than anger would have been. On the third night, she opened the book the moment she sat down and continued from the precise place where she had stopped on the first night. 40 minutes later, his hands relaxed at his sides, his jaw unclenched, and his breathing deepened. Josie looked at the clock and fixed the number in her mind, then continued reading for another 20 minutes to be certain. Afterward, she closed the book as quietly as she could and remained in the darkness for a while before leaving the room. On the fourth night, she did exactly the same thing, and again it took 40 minutes, almost without variation. She returned to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, and arranged everything in her mind like a sequence of numbers. It wasn't the book, because that same book had rested unopened on her lap during the second night, and had been opened during the third, and the 2 nights had produced opposite results. It wasn't the story, because he had never asked what happened next, never asked whether any character lived or died. He wasn't listening in the sense of following the narrative, and it wasn't her presence, because she had remained in the room for 7 hours on the second night, and he had never slept. Only one thing remained. There had to be a living person in the room, speaking aloud. Josie sat motionless with that conclusion for a very long time, and the more she considered it, the colder her spine became, because if a man could sleep only while hearing the voice of a real person speaking in the room, then somewhere in his past, silence must have taken something immense from him. She didn't know what it was. She had promised not to ask. Then another thought came, and this one left her even more dizzy than the first. That man could buy anything in the city. He had bought medication, doctors, audiobooks, and entire sleepless nights, receiving nothing in return. But the one thing that worked couldn't be found in any catalog, and purchased with money. It was a person sitting 10 feet from his bed, willing to read aloud until he fell asleep. And in that house, without a single framed photograph, that person was her. Josie lay down, pulled the blanket over herself, and before falling asleep, she thought she should have felt safe, because no one discarded the one thing they couldn't buy anywhere else. But she didn't feel safe. She felt as though she had just been bound to something, and she still didn't know what waited at the other end of the line. Wade took exactly 3 days to explore the entire house, and he did it in his own way, which meant holding his notebook against his chest and recording everything. He counted the steps leading down to the harbor. He wrote that the large glass door had 4 scratches in its lower left corner. He wrote that Mr. Otis made coffee at 6:15 every morning, and always poured 2 cups, even though he was the only person who drank it. Josie secretly read the notebook once while the boy was bathing, then closed it and never read it again, because there were some lines she couldn't bear, such as the one where he wrote that there were no photographs of anyone in the house, so it must be a new house. Emmett avoided the boy, not with irritation, but in the way someone walked around something he didn't know how to hold. Josie noticed that he changed the time he entered the kitchen so it wouldn't coincide with Wade's breakfast. Once, the 2 of them encountered each other in the hallway. The boy looked up, and Emmett stood there for 1 beat before nodding to him with the stiff formality someone might use toward a business associate in a conference room, then continued walking. Josie had seen him speak to the men at the harbor. She had seen him lower his voice and make an entire line of men straighten their backs. But before a 10-year-old child holding a notebook, he didn't know what to do. And it was the first time Josie had ever seen him uncertain about anything. Then one afternoon, Wade solved the problem in his own way. He walked directly into the study, stood beside the desk until Emmett looked up, tore a page from his notebook, and placed it before him. Josie was standing outside the door and saw everything. There was only one question written on the page. Were there fish beneath the harbor? And if so, what kind? Emmett studied the paper for quite a while. Then he closed the file before him, pushed it aside, and said there were fish, mostly black sea bass, and sometimes flounder, though they were rare near the shore. He explained that the water in that part of the harbor was cloudy, so they could only be seen rising near the surface in the early morning. He spoke in precisely the same voice he used when discussing money with the men at the docks, slow and clear, without adding or withholding a single word, never softening his tone into the kind adults used when speaking down to children. Wade nodded, recorded the answer in his notebook, then asked on another sheet of paper exactly what time early morning meant. Emmett said roughly 6 o'clock, perhaps earlier if the sky was clear. The boy wrote that down as well. And Josie stood in the hallway, with one hand gripping the door frame, listening to 2 people have a conversation in which only one of them made a sound. And she realized that this was the first time since the accident that an unfamiliar adult had answered her brother's question without looking toward her and waiting for her to translate. From that day forward, Wade woke at 6 o'clock. He sat on the steps behind the house with his notebook. Some mornings, Otis brought him a glass of milk and sat beside him. Other mornings, he sat alone. Josie didn't know whether Emmett saw him, and she didn't ask. A few days later, she passed the study and noticed a new sheet of paper on the desk, placed directly in the center where it would be impossible to overlook, the pencil marks more carefully formed than usual. She could read it from where she stood, and she stopped. The page said that his sister read to him every night, and she told him that when there was a human voice nearby, the darkness wasn't frightening. Josie felt her chest tighten, because she remembered exactly when she had said those words. It had been in a rented room on the 3rd floor, during the first year after Wade stopped speaking, when he awakened in terror every night, and she had said it merely because she needed something to say. She hadn't known, he remembered. She almost entered the room and took the page away. Then she realized it belonged to her brother, so she left it where it was and walked on. That evening, as she made her way down the hallway toward Emmett's room with the book in her hand, Josie passed the study and saw that the door was slightly open. Only one desk lamp was burning inside. Emmett stood before the low shelf, holding the only empty picture frame in the entire house. The frame Josie had noticed on her first day, and had never dared ask why it held nothing. He opened the back, placed Wade's paper inside, secured it, then returned the frame to the shelf, perfectly straight and precisely where it had always stood. Josie stepped backward so he wouldn't see her, and she remained in the darkness of the hallway for a long while before knocking on his bedroom door. On Saturday morning, Otis took Wade to therapy, and Josie had intended to remain at the house when Emmett asked whether she wanted to accompany him to the fish market, because they had run out of everything fresh and, according to him, the vendors charged him a different price when he went there himself. She went. The fish market stood at the far end of the harbor, wet and noisy, filled with the sound of crushed ice pouring into bins, and Josie immediately noticed something strange. No one greeted Emmett first. People merely straightened slightly as he passed and then continued working, as though greeting him aloud were something they knew better than to do. They had walked halfway down the row when Josie heard a raised voice at the last stall. A large man in an expensive coat that looked entirely out of place against the market floor stood with both hands braced on the counter, speaking down to the elderly vendor behind it. He said that if a man borrowed $2,000, he repaid $4,000. That was the rule, and the rule was the same for everyone. If the money wasn't there by that afternoon, he would take the stall, and the old man could sit on the docks and sell fish with his bare hands. The elderly man didn't argue. He merely stood there with both hands resting on the wet counter, repeating that he had been paying, that he paid every month, that he had the record book right there, and that the man should look at it. No one along the row turned to watch. Josie saw Emmett stop. He didn't quicken his pace, change his expression, or shout. He merely spoke one name, Rusk, exactly once, in a voice no louder than the one he used in the kitchen each morning. But within 2 seconds, all the noise in that half of the market disappeared, and Josie clearly saw a vendor 3 stalls away quietly turn off the running water. The man turned around. The color drained from his face so quickly that Josie could see it happening. He began to say, "Mr. Rourke, I am collecting for you. I am doing exactly what you told me." But Emmett raised one finger, no higher than his waist, and the man fell silent. He asked how much the old man had borrowed. $2,000, the vendor said. Emmett asked how much he had repaid. With trembling hands, the old man opened his record book and said 1,600. Emmett turned to the other man and asked where the figure of 4,000 had come from. Rusk couldn't answer. Emmett said, "I told you to collect exactly what people borrowed. I didn't tell you to double it. I didn't tell you to stand in my market and threaten to take the stall of a 70-year-old man." Then he spoke the words Josie would remember for the rest of her life, saying them so quietly that almost no one beyond the 3 of them could hear. Power isn't forcing someone who has nothing to kneel. That is cowardice dressed in the clothes of the strong. The man opened his mouth to speak. Emmett turned toward Otis, Pressid, who was standing behind them, and said the old man's debt was settled, including the principal and everything still unpaid, and that Rusk would never return to that district. "Take care of it for me." Otis nodded, placed one hand on the man's shoulder, and led him toward the market entrance. It ended so cleanly that Josie didn't have time to become afraid. The elderly vendor stood frozen behind his counter. Then he began to thank Emmett, stumbling over the words as he came around the stall and reached for his hand. Emmett had already turned away. He paused only long enough to place a stack of money on the counter, enough to replace the 2 cracked ice bins and repair the stall's torn awning, then walked directly to the car without allowing the old man to finish a single expression of gratitude. In the car, Josie remained silent for a long stretch before asking why he had bothered. What did $2,000 mean to a man like him? What did that fish stall mean to him? He stared through the window, and a long time passed before he answered, his voice sounding as though it had traveled from somewhere very far away, "Because I know what it is like to be trampled by someone else." He said nothing more, and Josie asked nothing more, because she had promised not to ask. But throughout the journey home, she kept thinking that she had seen 2 different men in the space of a single morning. One man had silenced an entire row of market stalls simply by speaking a name, and the other, only a few days earlier, had stood beneath a desk lamp and placed a schoolboy's handwritten page inside the only empty picture frame in his home. 3 weeks passed, and everything settled into a routine. At 11 o'clock, She knocked on the door, pulled the chair into its usual place, and opened the book. 40 minutes, sometimes 35, sometimes 50. She had learned to slow her reading during the longer passages, and no longer stopped halfway through to swallow against her dry throat. She kept a glass of water beside the leg of the chair. Some nights, he fell asleep before she could finish the chapter. Josie grew accustomed to sitting in the darkness and watching a man sleep, and she also grew accustomed to thinking of it as her job, something as ordinary as carrying trays or wiping tables, only with better pay. Until the 24th night, he had been asleep for more than an hour, his face more peaceful than she had ever seen it, and Josie had already closed the book and was preparing to rise when his entire body jerked violently. It wasn't the movement of someone changing position. It was the jolt of a person being ripped out of somewhere. His breathing shattered into short bursts. Both hands closed tightly around the edge of the blanket, and before he was fully awake, a name broke from his mouth, hoarse and fractured. Addie. Only that one word, but cold swept through Josie's entire body because the voice that had called that name wasn't the voice of the man who had silenced an entire row of market stalls the previous morning. It was the voice of a child standing in the darkness without knowing where he was. He shot upright, his chest rising and falling, his eyes wide as they stared into the empty space before him. For several seconds, he couldn't see the room or Josie. He was looking at someplace very far away, somewhere that belonged to a time long past. Josie didn't rise. She didn't call his name, ask whether he was all right, or ask who Addie was. She merely opened the book again, found the page she had just folded, and resumed reading from the middle of the sentence, in the same steady voice she had always used, neither louder nor gentler, as though nothing had happened in the room. She read one page. She heard his breathing begin to lengthen. She read another. He raised one hand to wipe his face, then slowly lay down again and turned toward the wall. She read another half chapter, long enough that he wouldn't have to say anything at all, then closed the book, moved the chair backward as quietly as she could, and left the room. In the hallway, she stood with her back against the wall for a long while. When she returned to her room, she lay down but couldn't sleep. She kept hearing the name inside her head, the way it had broken from him, the place where his voice had fractured between its two syllables, and she thought about how she had spent every night for the past 3 weeks, sitting in that room without knowing what she was sitting beside. She remembered the conclusion she had reached on the 4th night, that a living person had to be speaking inside the room before he could sleep, and now she understood that her conclusion had been incomplete. It had only been one half of the truth. The other half lay in why silence frightened him so deeply, and the answer was hidden behind a name of 2 syllables that he could speak only in his sleep. Josie pulled the blanket up to her chin. She had promised not to ask. She wouldn't ask, but would daylight spread across the water outside. She was still lying there with her eyes open, and the name still refused to leave her mind. Sloane Rayner came to the house on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, always carrying a thin file, always remaining for exactly 45 minutes, and during those 3 weeks, Josie had never exchanged more than 5 sentences with her. But that afternoon, when Josie emerged from Wade's room, Sloane was already standing in the middle of the hallway, without a file in her hands, and Josie understood immediately that the encounter had been arranged in advance. Sloane asked about the boy with perfect naturalness, asked whether his therapy schedule was working well, then said she had read Josie's file. Josie said she knew. Sloane smiled and said of course she knew, because Mr. Rourke never hired anyone without a file. Then she said she had worked with Emmett for 7 years, and during those 7 years, she had learned one thing. Everything pleasant that entered that house eventually left through another door. Josie asked what she meant. Sloane drew a check from inside her coat, folded in half, and extended it between 2 fingers. She didn't place it anywhere. She simply held it in the space between them. She said the amount was enough for Josie to move to another city, rent a decent place, pay everything that was overdue, and provide the boy with a full year of uninterrupted therapy somewhere no one knew who she was. She said it wasn't an expulsion. It was a clean way out, already signed, without conditions or binding documents. Josie didn't reach for it. Sloane maintained the same smile and continued in the properly warm voice with which she had greeted Josie on her first day. She said that she genuinely liked Josie. The fact that Emmett could sleep was a good thing, and no one denied it. But a man in Mr. Rourke's position wasn't permitted to have a soft place, because in his world, softness wasn't somewhere to rest. It was somewhere other people drove a blade. Then she spoke her final words as gently as though she were discussing the weather. You are a charming accident, Miss Calloway, but accidents should end before they become disasters. The hallway remained silent for a very long time. Josie looked at the check folded between Sloane's fingers, and thought about the notice raising her rent, the 2 overdue therapy payments, and the morning she had opened the 9th envelope already knowing all 3 lines it contained. Then she extended her hand, not to take the check, but merely to push Sloane's hand gently back toward her. "You have priced me far too low." Sloane raised one eyebrow. Josie continued, without raising her voice at all. "I have been called the ugliest name anyone can give a woman who works for hire, and I walked away from that place empty-handed because I wouldn't accept 1 cent from them. I have lived by that decision for 2 years. Do you think I would sell it now for a check?" Sloane didn't answer immediately. The smile remained perfectly still on her lips, but something else had changed in her eyes, and Josie saw it clearly. It was the look of someone who had just crossed a name out of one column and written it into another. Sloane folded the check once more, slipped it into her coat pocket, then said she truly admired Josie and hoped she would be able to hold on to that conviction for a long time. She wished Josie a pleasant evening, turned away, and walked down the hallway toward the door. Josie remained where she was until she heard the car engine start outside. She didn't tell Emmett what had happened. She didn't understand why she kept it from him. She only knew that when she sat in the chair 10 feet from his bed that evening and opened the book, her hands felt colder than usual. That night, Wade fell asleep early, and when Josie entered Emmett's room, he wasn't already lying in bed as he usually was. He sat on the edge of the mattress with both elbows resting on his knees, and he told her not to begin reading yet. She sat in the chair, placed the book face down on her lap, and waited. He said he knew what she had heard the previous week. Josie was about to tell him that he didn't need to explain, but he had already continued, his voice slow and even, neither rising nor falling, like someone reciting a page he had memorized so thoroughly that he no longer needed to see the words. He said Adeline was his younger sister. He had called her Addie since before she could walk. Their parents had died young, leaving only the 2 of them in the house. So everything he had done from the age of 17 until now, including the things he couldn't bring himself to speak about, had begun there. He said that when she was 22, she was in her final year of college and wanted to work with children. She hated what he did so deeply that every time she came home for dinner, the 2 of them inevitably argued. He said she was the only person in the world who dared scold him across the dinner table. Then he spoke about that night, and he kept it very brief. He said some men had come looking for him. They had gone to the exact place where he was staying, at a time when they knew he would be there, and they had calculated everything correctly, except for one thing. Addie had come to spend the night. He offered no further details. He spoke only of the result. He hadn't been harmed, not even a scratch, while his sister had been taken to the hospital that night and remained there for 11 days. Josie sat motionless. He said the doctors had told him that people in her condition could still hear. They couldn't be certain, but some cases suggested it was possible, and family members were encouraged to speak, to read something aloud, to let the person hear that someone was beside them. He said he had clung to that single statement for 11 days. Every night, he sat beside her bed and read aloud. He read anything he could find. The newspaper from the waiting room, a book a nurse had left on the table, the storybooks he ordered people to buy for him. He read without stopping because whenever he fell silent, only the sound of the machines remained in the room, and he was afraid of that sound. He said his voice had become hoarse by the 4th night, and by the 8th, he could barely make a sound. But he continued reading. A whisper was enough, as long as there was a voice. Every time he read, he told himself that she could hear him, that she knew he was there, that as long as he continued speaking, she would know she wasn't lying there alone. He stopped for a long while after saying that, but when he continued, his voice remained unchanged. He said that on the 12th night, he fell asleep in the middle of a sentence. He didn't know when it happened. He knew only that when he opened his eyes, daylight had come, the book was lying on the floor, the room was silent, and someone had pulled the sheet over her. Josie realized that her hands were gripping the cover of the book in her lap, though she didn't know when she had begun holding it so tightly. He said they told him it had happened at roughly 3 o'clock in the morning, that she hadn't suffered, and that even if he had been awake, nothing would have changed. He said he had heard those words many times during the past 3 years, and hadn't believed them once. Then he raised his head and looked at her, and for the first time in the entire story, his voice changed, only slightly, and only for one sentence. I am not afraid of sleeping. I am afraid of opening my eyes and knowing I left someone alone. Josie said nothing. 3 possible responses came to her, and she discarded all 3 because she understood that no words in any human language could reach that place, and that any attempt to comfort him would only be a way to ease her own discomfort. So she remained silent. She allowed the room to stay quiet for a long time. Then she opened the book, found the place where she had stopped the previous night, and began to read. Emmett lay down and turned toward her, his eyes still open. She read longer than she did on any other night. She continued even after his breathing had deepened, reading another chapter, and then another half-chapter, until she was certain that if he startled awake during the night, the first thing he would hear would still be a human voice. The following night, Emmett didn't mention the story he had told, and neither did Josie. But when she sat down in the chair, he asked where the book had come from, because he had noticed that she had read from the same one for more than a month. Josie looked down at the faded blue cover and said it had belonged to her mother. Then she opened it, turned several pages, and showed him the margins. Her mother had been in the habit of writing in pencil along the edges. Nothing important, only scattered little phrases. "This part is good. Read more slowly here." Josie kept asking about this part. On one page, she had written exactly 3 words. "Read to Wade." Josie said her mother had read that book to her from the time she was 6 years old. Then more than a decade later, she had read the same book to Wade, but she hadn't lived long enough to finish it the second time. Emmett asked nothing more. He merely lay there and waited, and Josie realized that his silent patience was more difficult to resist than any question could have been. 4 years ago, she said. Then she stopped. She looked down at the book in her lap instead of toward the bed, and she heard herself speaking the words more slowly than she wanted. She said the whole family had gone to visit her grandmother in Pittsburgh, traveling in the family car, and Josie was supposed to drive on the return journey. She had promised her mother before they even left. Her father had just finished a night shift at the factory and had slept for only 2 hours that morning. He said he would drive the first part, and then they would switch. She said she had been sitting in the back seat with Wade, and she stopped a second time. She ran one hand along the edge of the page, then continued. She had fallen asleep. She said she had meant to close her eyes only for a little while, but when she opened them again, they had traveled more than 200 miles. Her father was still behind the wheel, and no one had awakened her, because no one in that family had ever woken her to make her do anything. She fell silent for a very long time after saying that. Emmett didn't hurry her. She said her mother died at the scene. Her father held on for another 2 months in the hospital before he died as well. She told him nothing else about that night, not one word, and he didn't ask. She said only that Wade had stopped speaking afterward. He could still hear and understand. The doctors said there was nothing wrong with his throat. He simply didn't speak. He began writing on loose sheets of paper, then in school notebooks, and eventually in the notebook he carried now. For 4 years, she had taken him to therapy and changed providers 3 times, and each one had given her a different name for his condition. But she knew only one thing. That 10-year-old boy had never blamed her, not even once, and that was the hardest part of all. She said that if he had ever become angry with her, perhaps she might have found it easier to breathe. Emmett asked whether she had ever told anyone. She said no. She hadn't told the diner owner, hadn't told any of Wade's therapists, and most of all, she hadn't told the boy, because if he learned that his sister had been supposed to drive on the return journey, she didn't know what he would do with that knowledge. Then she spoke her final sentence, and this time, she raised her eyes and looked directly at Emmett. "You know, you and I both owe a debt to sleep." He didn't answer. He looked at her for a long time in the darkness of the room, and there was no pity in his gaze, nor the polite tenderness people often put on when listening to another person's grief. There was only recognition. They sat in silence 10 feet apart. A man whose name the entire harbor district spoke only in lowered voices, and a waitress who had been driven out of every restaurant in the city, both thinking the same thing, that the force which had cut their lives in 2 was so similar, it was almost cruelly absurd. It had merely arrived on 2 different nights, 1 year apart, at opposite ends of the city. Then Josie opened the book and began to read. Her voice sounded different that night, rougher and slower, and she had to stop twice to catch her breath. Emmett said nothing about it. He merely lay there listening until sleep came, and for the first time in more than a month, he fell asleep before she reached the end of the chapter. It happened on a Thursday night at roughly 2 o'clock in the morning, more than an hour after Josie had returned to her room. She was beginning to drift off when she heard a car brake sharply in the courtyard, followed by doors closing and footsteps, many footsteps, rushing through the entrance hall below. Every light in the hallway came on at once, flooding the narrow space beneath her bedroom door with brightness. She heard men speaking quickly and urgently, then the sound of something falling downstairs. After that came Otis's voice, firm and decisive, giving someone an order. Josie sat upright, and her first instinct wasn't to open the door and find out what was happening. It was to run into the room next door. Wade lay facing the wall with the blanket pulled to his shoulders, breathing evenly. He hadn't heard anything. His room was upstairs at the end of the hallway, separated from the entrance hall by an entire flight of stairs and 2 sets of doors. Josie stood there watching her brother sleep while everything unfolded below, and she understood that the only good fortune they had that night was that he was sleeping deeply. She locked his door from the inside, sat on the floor with her back against it, and remained there until the footsteps below became less frequent and finally disappeared, and someone turned off some of the hallway lights. She didn't go downstairs. She didn't ask any questions. She remained there until morning. At 6 o'clock, Wade turned over and opened his eyes. When he saw his sister sitting on the floor, he raised his eyebrows in surprise and reached for his notebook to write something. Josie said she had simply awakened early, and she smiled at him, surprised that she was still capable of smiling. At 7 o'clock, she packed their belongings. At 8, she carried the suitcase downstairs. The entrance hall was as clean as though nothing had happened. The floor was dry. All the lights had been turned off, and only one chair had been pushed out of its usual place and hadn't yet been returned. Emmett was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He looked at the suitcase in her hand, then set down his cup. He didn't ask why. "I am leaving," Josie said. "I am not asking you what happened last night, and I don't intend to ask, because I told you from the beginning that I didn't want to know, and I have kept my word. I knew who you were before I ever entered this house." She said she wasn't leaving because the events of the previous night had suddenly revealed something to her. Then she placed the suitcase on the floor and spoke the sentence she had rehearsed in her mind throughout the 2 hours she spent sitting against Wade's door. "Last night, the boy slept soundly. What happens the next time?" Emmett didn't answer immediately. Josie stood there and waited. And as she waited, she realized what she was expecting. She expected him to say the house was safe, that it wouldn't happen again, that she was overreacting. She expected him to remind her that they had an agreement. In a vague and frightened way, she waited for the voice he had used at the fish market. The voice that needed only to speak a name to make an entire row of people stand straight. But he did none of those things. He remained silent for a moment, then nodded. "You are right." He called Otis into the room and instructed him to prepare the car, take Josie and Wade anywhere she wished, whether within the city or beyond it, and arrange a decent place for them to live during the first 6 months. He told Josie that her wages for that week and the entire amount not yet due would be paid in one sum, not to persuade her to stay, but because she had already done enough, and he didn't want her to be forced to begin again from nothing one more time in her life. He said there would be no conditions attached, no documents to sign, and no one following her. If she ever needed anything, she should call Otis rather than Emmett, because calling Emmett would only bring trouble into her life. Then he spoke his final words in the same even voice. "You entered this house as a free woman. You will leave it as a free woman." Josie picked up the suitcase. She crossed the entrance hall, reached the door, placed one hand on the knob, and stopped. She stood there for a long time, long enough that Otis turned from the courtyard to look at her, because a thought had suddenly risen inside her mind, something simple and perfectly clear. A truly dangerous man, a man with enough power to keep anyone from leaving that city, would never open the door and tell her she was free to go. Josie didn't leave. She kept the suitcase packed in the corner of her room for the next 2 weeks, as a reminder that the door remained open. And then one morning, she found herself unpacking it without even realizing she had begun. Otis had additional locks installed upstairs and changed the night security schedule, and no one ever mentioned what had happened that Thursday night again. Life returned to its familiar rhythm. A knock on the door at 11 o'clock. The chair pulled into place. The book opened. Then one afternoon in October, Josie made tea and carried it into the study because Emmett had been skipping meals for several days, and she had begun granting herself the right to notice such things. The door was partly open, so she pushed it inward with her elbow. Otis stood beside the desk, having just set down a thick file, and was in the middle of saying something about 3 shipping containers at berth number 7. Emmett told him to leave it there. Josie approached, intending to place the cup of tea on the corner of the desk, and as she bent down, her eyes passed over the first page of the open file. A photograph had been stapled to the upper left corner. The cup slipped from her hand, struck the edge of the desk, and rolled onto the carpet, spilling hot tea into a dark stain. Otis stepped forward, but Josie didn't move. She stood staring at the photograph, at the face that had entered her dreams for 2 years, the face whose name she had practiced saying before the mirror more times than she could count during the first year, before she finally stopped, because no one was listening. Thurston Ballard. She bent down and caught the file as it began sliding from the edge of the desk, gripping it with both hands, and she was trembling so violently that the pages inside shifted out of place. Emmett rose. Her voice had become completely hoarse when she said that was the man who had destroyed her life. The room remained silent for a long time. Then Emmett asked whether she was certain. Josie gave a short laugh that contained nothing at all and said, "I worked under that man for 20 months, and you are asking whether I am certain?" She placed the file on the desk and began turning the pages, and the farther she read, the colder her hands became. The file described the ships arriving at berth number 7, the people traveling aboard them, adults who paid for a place in the cargo hold to reach the city, and where they were taken after coming ashore. There was a list of addresses. Josie stopped at the third line because it was the address of the restaurant where she had worked, the same rear entrance she had passed through every day for 20 months. Otis explained slowly that during the past 2 years, Ballard had tried 3 times to purchase the operating rights to that section of the harbor, and all 3 attempts had encountered the same obstacle. Emmett said that obstacle was him. He said there were many things within his territory of which he wasn't proud, but trafficking people had never been one of them, and everyone knew that rule. Ballard needed control of the harbor, so that he would no longer have to seek anyone's permission. Josie heard the words without fully hearing them, because something else was assembling itself inside her mind, and the pieces fitting together sent a terrible cold from the back of her neck through her entire body. She spoke the name Marisol Vega. Emmett asked who that was. Josie said she was a 19-year-old girl who washed dishes in the kitchen, and she had died during her shift. Everyone had been told that she had worked herself beyond exhaustion. Then Josie spoke more slowly, saying that for 2 years, she had believed such a thing was possible. When people worked 14 hours a day, something like that could happen. But now she understood that it hadn't happened that way. Marisol hadn't been allowed to leave that kitchen. None of the people working below that restaurant had been permitted to leave. And on the night Josie stood before Ballard and spoke about what she had witnessed, she had believed she was accusing an employer of exploiting his workers. She hadn't known what she had placed herself directly in the path of. Her legs would no longer hold her, and she sank into the chair. Almost speaking to herself, she said she had spent 2 years walking throughout the city, carrying her application to 9 different places, and no one had hired her. During all that time, she had believed it was because people trusted Ballard's word more than hers. Emmett picked up the file, closed it, placed it on the desk, and kept one hand resting on top of it. He offered no words of comfort. He said only that everything was clear now, that he had been following the operation for 7 months without ever knowing it was connected to her, and that from that day forward, it was no longer merely a matter of business to him. Then he spoke quietly, and Josie raised her eyes to him as he said it. He will pay for all of it. 10 days later, Josie went to the supermarket alone in the afternoon, and when she pushed her cart into the parking lot, she found a black car parked across the space directly behind her vehicle. The rear door opened, and Thurston Ballard stepped out. He didn't approach her. He merely stood beside the open door with both hands in his coat pockets, and smiled at her with the same smile he had always worn while moving between the restaurant tables and asking guests whether they were satisfied. "Miss Calloway," he said, "it has been a long time." Josie stood motionless behind the shopping cart. She could hear her heart beating in her ears. He said he had only a few minutes, that he didn't want to frighten her, and that he had come in good faith. Then he said he knew where she was living. He spoke the name of the harbor district and allowed it to fall into the space between them before smiling, as though he had merely mentioned a mutual friend. He said he had no interest in whatever arrangement she had with Mr. Rourke. That was a private matter, and everyone had to find a way to survive these days. He cared about only one thing, an old matter that, once resolved, would allow both sides to rest more easily. He nodded, and the driver brought over a thin set of papers inside a leather folder, along with a pen. Ballard said it was a sworn statement. Its contents were very simple. 2 years earlier, she had misunderstood what she witnessed. At the time, she had been under severe stress because of a family tragedy, and she was now withdrawing every allegation she had made. He said that once she signed, all her debts would be erased, including her rent, the boys' therapy, and every installment payment she still owed, each amount of which he knew down to the exact figure. Her reputation would be restored through an official public statement, and he would hire her as the manager of his new establishment on Charles Street, at twice the salary of her former position, beginning the following month. He said she would regain everything she had lost, and more. Josie looked at the papers in the driver's hands. Then she reached out and took the pen. It was heavier than she had expected, and for exactly 1 beat, she saw everything. She saw the notice raising her rent, no longer lying face down on the table. She saw the 2 overdue therapy payments erased, and Wade attending without interruption for 1 year, 2 years, for as long as he needed. She saw herself wearing a manager's uniform again, standing in a clean kitchen and never lowering her eyes when someone spoke her name. She saw the 9 envelopes containing 3 polite lines disappear from her life forever. An entirely different life stood only 1 signature away. Ballard didn't hurry her. He knew this was the moment to remain silent. Then Josie thought of Marisol Vega. She thought about how withdrawing her statement would mean that Marisol's name would forever belong only to a young woman who had worked herself beyond exhaustion. She thought about the people who were still beneath that kitchen that very afternoon. People who had paid for a place in a ship's cargo hold to reach the city. And she thought about the pencil marks in the margin of the book, the 3 words her mother had written, "Read to Wade," the handwriting of a woman who had never possessed $10,000 in a bank account and had never needed to think twice about the difference between right and wrong. Josie placed the pen on the leather folder. She pushed the entire set of papers back toward the driver. Ballard asked whether she was certain, and his voice was still warm. "You took my job," she said. "You took my name, and you did it so easily that I still can't understand how. But there is one thing you cannot buy, Mr. Ballard, and that is my ability to look at myself in the mirror each morning." The smile disappeared from his face, not gradually, but within a single second, and for the first time in her life, Josie saw what had always been waiting beneath it. Very quietly, he told her she had just made a grave mistake. Then he returned to the car. It reversed, turned around, and drove out of the parking lot. Josie remained there with the shopping cart for a long while, both hands gripping the handle, until she was certain her legs were steady enough to hold her again. 4 days later, Otis summoned everyone to the study, and Josie knew something was wrong from the way he stood. The safe in the study had been opened, and the cash inside, an amount not large compared with the sums that regularly moved through that house, had disappeared. But that wasn't the most serious matter. The most serious matter concerned the file on berth number 7. Someone had photographed a copy and sent it outside the house, and Otis said he knew this with certainty because his people had traced where it was the previous afternoon. He placed several photographs and a brief report on the desk. There were fingerprints on both sides of the original file's cover, very clear and in the exact places where someone would have held it with both hands. Otis revealed the result of the comparison in the voice of a man who deeply regretted having to say it. The prints belonged to Josie. The room fell completely silent. Josie stood there without understanding for roughly 3 seconds. 3 seconds that felt as long as an entire afternoon. Then she understood. She remembered the cup of tea rolling onto the carpet. She remembered the file slipping from the edge of the desk, and both her hands reaching out to catch it, holding it while she trembled so violently that the pages inside shifted out of place. She remembered how long it had remained in her hands. She opened her mouth to explain, then closed it again, because she had just realized that if she told that story now, it would sound exactly like something a guilty person would say. Emmett didn't look at the evidence on the desk. He looked at Otis and spoke 3 very short sentences. "This ends here. No one is to mention it or compare anything further. Give all of this to me." Otis nodded, and Josie knew that was all it would take. In that house, once Emmett spoke, the matter was finished. Within 30 seconds, every photograph on the desk would disappear, and no one in the world would ever mention her name in connection with it again. She stepped forward, placed one hand on his arm, and stopped him. "Wait." Emmett turned toward her. "I know you can do this," Josie said. "I know you only have to speak 1 sentence, and it will be over." Then she asked whether he knew what would happen afterward. She said his people wouldn't say anything. They would nod, clean everything away, and never mention the matter in his presence again. But they would remember. They would remember that Josie's fingerprints had once been found on something that should never have left that room, and their employer had ordered the investigation closed. From that day forward, she would no longer be the woman who read to him in that house. She would be the girl the harbor boss protected. She said she had spent 2 years living beneath a name she had never chosen, and she knew exactly how such a name clung to a person. She wouldn't accept another one, not even a name he gave her because he cared about her. Emmett didn't pull his arm away. He remained still for a long time, and Josie saw his jaw tighten. She saw how hard he had to fight against doing what he did with every other problem in his life. Then he asked what she wanted. "Leave everything exactly as it is," she said. "Don't remove a single photograph. Mr. Otis should continue investigating as he always does, and he should investigate me as well, thoroughly, and without overlooking anything." She said that when the truth came to light, she wanted it revealed through evidence, not because Emmett had ordered everyone to remain silent. Otis studied her for a moment, then said slowly that he had worked in that house for 31 years, and this was the first time anyone had ever asked him to investigate her personally. "Then you should begin," Josie said. After that, she asked him only one question. Who had told him where the copied file was located? Otis took 9 days. He did exactly what Josie had asked, which meant beginning with her. He examined every hour of her schedule over the previous 3 weeks, questioned the owner of her former diner, the therapy center, and even the driver of the final bus route, and showed no discomfort about doing any of it in front of her. Then he worked backward. He traced the copy, determined when it had been photographed, how it had been sent, and who had received it first. Once he had that first name, he didn't stop. He followed the thread farther back through an intermediary account, a consulting company registered in Delaware, and 7 years of telephone records that he himself had preserved. On Wednesday morning, he placed a stack of papers on Emmett's desk that was thicker than the file on berth number 7. He said nothing, merely opened it to a page he had already marked. That afternoon, Sloane Rayner arrived as usual, as she did on Tuesdays and Thursdays, for exactly 45 minutes, carrying a thin file in her hand. She entered the study, saw Otis standing in the corner and Josie seated beside the window, and understood immediately. Josie saw it on her face, that very brief moment when every calculation was completed and no path remained. Emmett told her to sit down. He pushed the stack of papers across the desk. Sloane didn't open it. She merely placed her own file down with perfect neatness, sat with her back straight, and said she had no intention of denying anything. Emmett asked how long it had been. 3 years, she said. He asked why. Sloane looked directly at him and said she had cleaned up his messes for 7 years. She said every filthy matter he hadn't wanted on his hands had crossed her desk first. Yet during those 7 years, not one document in his entire empire had ever carried her name. She said Ballard had offered her something Emmett never had, a position that belonged to her under her own name. Then she fell silent. Josie had expected Emmett to become angry. For 9 days, she had carried an image of his anger in her mind, and she had been afraid of it. But he didn't rise. He never raised his voice. He sat silently for a long while, then said very quietly that when Sloane was 26 years old, no office in the city would hire her, and he had been the one who read her entire file in a single evening and called her the following morning. I gave you a seat at this table. I allowed you to know things even Otis didn't know. Then he spoke his final sentence, his voice no louder than when he had asked how long it had been. You never asked me. If you had asked, I would have given it to you. The room was so quiet that Josie could clearly hear the water outside the harbor, and she realized that this man's silence was more chilling than any shout, because anger still contained frustration, while his silence contained only one thing. The decision had already been made before Sloane entered the room. Sloane understood it as well. She asked what he intended to do. Emmett said he wouldn't touch her. He said her license to practice law would be on the desk of the State Bar Association by Monday, together with the 7 years of records Otis had preserved. Every account held in her name at 3 separate institutions would be closed that week, and every other client she represented would receive a letter on the same morning. She would walk out of that house on her own 2 feet. No one would stop her in the courtyard, and she would live a very long life with exactly what she had sold him to obtain, a name. The only difference was that beginning the following week, that name would no longer open a single door in the city. Sloane rose. When she reached the doorway, she stopped and turned to look at Josie, not Emmett. I warned you, she said. You said many things, Josie replied. I told you that a man in his position wasn't permitted to have a soft place. After saying that, Sloane left, and the door closed behind her. After a long silence, Otis was the next person to speak. He said there were 2 more matters in the file that he hadn't yet presented, and neither had anything to do with berth number 7. Otis opened the file to the second marked page, and said that while tracing 7 years of telephone calls backward, he had encountered a period that forced him to stop and begin again 3 times, because he couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was April, 3 years earlier. He placed a statement on the desk. During 10 days that month, Sloane Rayner had called the same number 6 times. That number was later registered under the name of a consulting company in Delaware. The same company Otis had spent the previous 9 days tracing back to funding from Thurston Ballard's office. The 4th call during those 10 days lasted 4 minutes. Otis said he didn't have the contents of the conversation, but he had something else. He turned to the next page. It was an internal proposal written by Sloane herself, dated the day after that call and sent to Emmett, advising him to move temporarily and listing 3 safe addresses. The second address on that list was the house where Emmett had lived throughout that spring. It was the same house where Addie had come to spend the night. Emmett said nothing. Otis continued in the same even voice, saying that what happened that night hadn't been a mistake involving the wrong address, nor had it been the settling of accounts between rival gangs, as everyone in the city had believed for 3 years. Ballard had tried 3 times to purchase the operating rights to the harbor, and all 3 times, the same man had stood in his way. The fastest way to remove a man from one's path wasn't to kill him, because his death would cause the entire city to rise. It was to break him from the inside. Everyone had one place that, once struck, could leave them unable to think clearly for years. And the person who knew exactly where that place was, the only person in the organization who knew, was the attorney who had eaten dinner in Emmett's home and heard him speak his sister's name. Josie reached out and gripped the edge of the window. She looked toward Emmett, and he remained seated with both hands resting motionless on the desk, not one feature of his face changing. Otis turned to the final page and said there was one more matter. 2 years earlier, a complaint concerning working conditions and a death in the kitchen of Ballard's restaurant chain had been filed. It included the complainant's name and copies of payroll records. The complaint was entered into the system, transferred to the review department, and then went no farther. During that same week, the consulting company in Delaware paid someone involved in the review process, and the person who had arranged the payment and signed the paperwork was Sloane Rayner. Otis said he was deeply sorry, then placed the document before Josie. She looked at her name typed across the page. She remained silent for a very long time. For 2 years, she had believed no one listened, because she had been nothing more than a kitchen worker while Ballard was who he was. She had believed she lost because she was too small. Now she knew that her complaint had never lost. It had simply been lifted out of its path by a hand, the same hand that, 1 year earlier, had lifted an address from another piece of paper. The same person had paid for both. The same harbor lay behind both. 3 years, one purpose, and 2 people sitting in that room who had never known why their lives had collapsed. Emmett rose. He didn't call anyone or pick up the telephone. He instructed Otis to take the entire file, all 7 years of it, directly to the federal prosecutor's office on Monday morning, submit it personally, obtain a receipt, and use no intermediary. He ordered every account held in Sloane's name closed. He instructed Otis to send a copy to the State Bar Association that same morning. Then he told him that no one was to touch her, not one person, and if any of his people acted on their own, they would bear the consequences themselves. Otis nodded and left. Emmett remained standing alone in the middle of the room, looking at the picture frame on the low shelf, the frame containing the schoolboy's handwritten page. Josie heard him speak very quietly, not to her. "I would have given you the entire world if you had asked. Instead, you chose to sell a name." Then he fell silent. And Josie, sitting beside the window with the document bearing her name in her hands, realized that for 3 years, both of them had been wandering through the darkness searching for the answer to the same question, never knowing that the answer had been walking into that house every Tuesday and Thursday. The file was submitted at 9 o'clock on Monday morning, with a receipt, and afterward, everything moved faster than anyone in that house had expected. On Monday afternoon, 2 law firms representing Ballard's business partners sent notices terminating their contracts. On Tuesday, the bank froze 3 accounts belonging to the restaurant group pending review. On Wednesday, the city council issued a statement temporarily suspending his position as a council member, and the statement was written in language so polite that anyone reading it immediately understood that no one wanted to stand near him anymore. On Thursday, 2 establishments on Charles Street closed, and photographs taken inside the kitchens began appearing on the evening news. 4 days. Josie sat before the television watching the report and felt no relief at all. She didn't understand why until Otis entered the room and spoke the thought she had been trying not to consider. He said people were dangerous in ordinary ways, while they still had something to lose. The previous 4 days had taken everything from Ballard, and a man with nothing left to lose had nothing left to consider. Emmett agreed. He said the first priority was getting the boy away. Josie called Corinne, the only friend from her former life who had remained in contact with her, a woman who lived in a small town a little more than an hour's drive from the city. Corinne didn't ask why. She merely said, "Bring him here." And after ending the call, Josie had to sit in silence for several seconds because the ease of that kindness made her want to cry. She went upstairs and told Wade that she had some work to do for a few days, so he would stay with Miss Corinne. Corinne had a large garden, a yellow dog named Biscuit, and an attic bedroom where he could sleep. Josie spoke in the most ordinary voice she could manage. The boy opened his notebook and wrote a question. "Are you all right?" Josie said she was fine. He studied her a little longer than necessary, then nodded and went to pack, placing his notebook and pencil case inside his backpack before anything else. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Otis loaded the bag into the trunk. Emmett walked all the way out to the car, He bent until he was level with Wade and said there was a small pond behind Corinne's house, and that fish lived in it. They weren't black sea bass, but another kind, and he wanted to know what kind they were, so he asked Wade to record it for him. The boy nodded with complete seriousness, exactly as Emmett had when answering his question in the study. Then he climbed into the car. Josie stood in the courtyard, and as the car began to move, Wade turned, pressed one hand against the window, and waved. She waved back. The boy smiled with the simple happiness of a child about to spend a few days away, knowing nothing more than that. She watched until the car turned off the road without a name sign and disappeared completely. Then she went back into the house and saw that Emmett was still standing in the same place in the middle of the courtyard, staring toward the end of the road. He remained there for a long while after she had gone inside. The following evening, the prosecutor arranged to meet them at an office near the old warehouse district, and Emmett said he could go alone. But Josie said that if part of the file carried her name, she was going with him. A fine rain was falling when they left close to 10 o'clock, and when Otis turned toward the eastern exit, he saw 2 vehicles parked across the road with their lights off. "Stay down," Otis said. Then he reversed and drove diagonally through the narrow space between 2 warehouse walls. Metal shrieked against metal, followed by a violent impact against the right side of the car. By then, Emmett had already pulled Josie beneath the level of the seat and covered her with his body, and his head struck the doorframe when the car lurched onto the sidewalk. 3 seconds later, they had reached the main road and were racing away, and nothing behind them was able to follow. Josie sat upright. Emmett was still leaning against the door with one hand pressed to his temple, and he said he was all right in his usual voice. Then he repeated the same sentence roughly half a minute later, using exactly the same words as though he hadn't already spoken them. Josie heard it, and cold swept through her entire body. She turned on the overhead light, took his face in her hands, and told him to look at her hand. One pupil responded more slowly than the other. She asked where he was, and he answered correctly. She asked whom they had met that evening, and he paused a little too long before answering. Otis said he couldn't take them to a city hospital, not that night, and he called a private physician on the other side of the city. 40 minutes. 40 minutes is fine, Josie said, speaking more loudly than necessary because she needed to reassure herself. Then she turned and saw Emmett's eyelids beginning to close. She shook his shoulder. "Mr. Rourke, open your eyes." He opened them and looked at her, but they began closing again. And in that exact second, Josie realized the cruel absurdity of what was happening inside the car. For nearly 4 months, she had spent every night sitting 10 feet from him and guiding him into sleep. Now she had to keep him outside it. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the book. It was soaked through, its blue cover darkened by the water, its first pages stuck together. She tried to open one, and the paper tore beneath her fingers. So she lowered it onto her lap, placed both hands against his face, and began reciting from memory. She recited the first chapter, the one she had read so many times over the past 4 months that she no longer needed to see the words. Then the second chapter. He managed to keep his eyes open for a while before fading again, and each time, she shook his shoulder and resumed from the sentence she had left unfinished. By the end of the 3rd chapter, she had run out of words. She remained silent for half a second, then began telling him a story. She told him about the previous Saturday morning, when Wade sat on the steps behind the house and Otis brought him a glass of milk. Josie had been watching from the kitchen when she saw the boy laugh, truly laugh, without sound but with his shoulders shaking, and she had been forced to turn away because she didn't want him to see his sister crying over something so small. She said she wanted one ordinary morning, nothing more than a breakfast table, 3 chairs, coffee, and someone asking, "What do you plan to do today?" She said she hadn't dared imagine such a thing in 4 years, had never permitted herself to think about it, because whenever she did, she felt as though she were asking for something that didn't belong to her. Emmett opened his eyes and spoke her name. "Yes, I am here," she said. "Keep talking." He couldn't speak again, so she spoke for him. "Mr. Rourke, I haven't given you permission to go anywhere. Do you remember? I haven't finished reading. There is more than half the book left. You don't know how it ends, and I refuse to tell you in advance. You owe me that ending." She continued speaking, sentence after sentence, never allowing silence to enter for even 1 second, because she understood too well what silence did to this man, and she wouldn't let him hear it that night. The car crossed the bridge and passed beneath rows of yellow lights, and Otis didn't speak once during those 40 minutes. He looked into the rearview mirror only 3 times. When they arrived, the door opened, and several people ran out with a stretcher. And in the moment, Josie released Emmett so they could take him away. She felt his fingers close faintly around her hand, a grip so weak it was barely there, but strong enough to tell her that he could still hear her. The doctor said Emmett had suffered a mild traumatic brain injury with a small hematoma, but he wouldn't need surgery and had to remain still under observation for at least 10 days. Emmett was fully conscious again by noon the following day, and the first thing he did was ask whether the file had reached the prosecutor. The second was to instruct Otis not to let anyone call Corinne, and not to allow the boy to learn anything. On the third day, the prosecutor's office called. They said they had enough evidence to bring charges against the operation at berth number 7. But the case involving the restaurants was weak, because 2 years had passed. The internal personnel records had been reconstructed, and the file belonging to the only person who had ever submitted a complaint had disappeared from the system. Without additional evidence, that part of the case would be dropped. Emmett tried to sit up. Josie placed one hand on his shoulder and told him to lie down. "I will go," she said. He told her to let Otis take her. "Mr. Otis may drive me to the door, but I am going inside alone," she said in the voice Emmett had learned not to challenge since that night in the harbor diner. The following morning, Josie sat in a conference room on the 9th floor across from 3 people she had never met. On the table before her was only the faded blue-covered book, its edges still curled from the water. One of them asked what she had brought. "I brought what I was too afraid to submit with the complaint 2 years ago, because I was afraid that if I surrendered everything, I would have nothing left." She drew the book closer, asked for a letter opener, and cut through the lining along the spine. No one in the room spoke. She slipped 2 fingers inside and withdrew a thin set of yellowed papers, folded into quarters. Pages that had been opened and folded so many times that they were nearly torn along the creases. There were copies of the payroll records for the entire kitchen covering 20 months, with names, hours, and people whose names appeared nowhere in the restaurant group's official personnel files. There were also 3 photographs she had taken with her phone on 3 separate nights, at the same rear door, the door she had passed through for 20 months, the door whose lock had been installed backward. She placed everything on the table and pushed it toward them. One person picked up a photograph and examined it for a long time, before setting it down and looking toward the person beside him. No one asked why she had hidden the evidence inside a book. 4 weeks later, the trial began. Josie went alone, wearing the same coat she had once worn to her night shifts, because she owned no other one and didn't want to buy another. Emmett wasn't there. He had asked whether she needed him to come, and she had said no, so he hadn't asked a second time. When her name was called in the courtroom, she walked forward and recounted everything one event at a time, slowly and clearly, without adding or withholding a single detail. For nearly an hour, she never once looked toward the seats on the other side. Only after finishing her testimony and rising to step down did she turn her head. Thurston Ballard was watching her. His smile was gone, and his eyes held a question. The question men like him always asked when everything was over. Why? What had she gained from any of this? Josie stopped. She spoke only one sentence, not loudly, but clearly enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear. "I didn't come here to watch you fall. I came so the name Marisol Vega would be spoken aloud once, in a place where people were required to listen." Then she stepped down. She sat in the last row for the rest of the morning, and when the court clerk read the names of the people listed in the case file, speaking each one aloud so it could be entered into the official record, Josie sat with her back straight and listened until the end. When the clerk reached that name, she didn't cry. She merely closed her eyes for a moment. At noon, she left the courthouse and stood on the steps beneath the sunlight, and she realized that for 2 years, she had believed what she needed was to be vindicated, to hear someone say she had been right. But standing there now, she understood that wasn't what she had needed. She had needed what had just happened inside that courtroom. A name buried for 2 years had finally been spoken aloud among people who were required to sit in silence and listen. The Wednesday morning news carried her name. It wasn't displayed in any prominent line, only mentioned in a short paragraph in the middle of the article, which stated that a complaint filed 2 years earlier by a former shift manager had been interfered with and removed from the system, and that the same woman was later accused of theft without a single record supporting the allegation. Josie read the paragraph 3 times on her phone while sitting on the steps behind the house, and she didn't feel what she had imagined she would feel for 2 years. She felt only tired, a deep and strangely pleasant exhaustion, the weariness of someone who had finally set down a burden carried for so long that she had forgotten it was there. That afternoon, she visited the diner by the harbor. The owner was standing behind the counter, and when she saw Josie, she hurried around it, embraced her, then pulled her toward the wall behind the register and pointed. She had cut the paragraph from the newspaper and attached it to the wall beside the business license. She said she had put it there that morning and made both servers read it. And she had told them, "This girl worked night after night here and never took a single dollar from me." Josie sat on a stool at the counter and cried right there in the middle of the diner at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, in full view of customers seated at 2 tables. For Emmett, everything unfolded far more slowly and at far greater cost. He had submitted 7 years of records, and those 7 years contained many things that concerned more than Sloan or Ballard. His new attorney told him directly that submitting everything was the same as handing himself over. Emmett submitted all of it. Negotiating the agreement with the prosecutors took 4 months, and its price was the dissolution of 2 companies, the loss of operating rights at 3 docks, the seizure or forced liquidation of most of his assets, and a very long list of things he would never again be permitted to do in the city. Otis remained beside him throughout those 4 months, and one evening, he told Josie very quietly that Emmett's father had spent 30 years building it all, while his son had signed it away in a single afternoon. What remained was a small transportation company at berth number 9, legal, properly documented, and independently audited, so small that the people who had once lowered their voices when speaking Emmett's name no longer bothered to mention it. He told Josie he felt lighter, and she believed him because she had seen how he slept during those months. He used almost all the money remaining after the liquidation to establish a fund. It paid for attorneys and legal documents for the people who had once been confined in Ballard's kitchens, gave them the wages they had never received, and helped them find new employment. Emmett didn't attach his own name to it. He gave it 2 names, Adeline and Marisol, and when people asked who they were, he said only that they were 2 people who should still be here. One evening, near the end of spring, Emmett and Josie sat on the steps behind the house looking across the water, and she asked whether he regretted it. He said no. Then, after a while, he added that for 3 years, he had believed that if he suffered long enough, it would be a way of repaying his debt to his sister. He hadn't slept, hadn't allowed himself a single peaceful morning, and had mistaken that for loyalty. Now he understood that it had only been another way of hiding, because punishing himself was much easier than continuing to live while carrying the loss with him. He said he had forgiven himself, not because Addie was coming back, because she never would, but because he had stopped demanding payment from himself. Josie said nothing. She merely sat there with both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold, watching the water change color, and thought about the night she had spent 40 minutes inside a car, speaking without pause to keep this man from slipping into sleep. Then she thought about how he could sleep now, and how both things had come from the very same place. 6 months later, on an ordinary autumn night, Josie pulled the chair into its usual place, as she did every evening, and opened the blue-covered book, the same book whose spine she had restored after the trial, at a cost greater than buying a new copy. Emmett fell asleep before she reached the end of the 2nd page, something that had begun happening often. She was about to close the book when a small hand came to rest on the page. Wade stood beside the chair, barefoot, his hair tousled from sleep. He looked at her, then gently took the book from his sister's hands, turned back several pages, and found the exact page with the 3 words written in pencil along the margin. "Read to Wade." Then he held the book in both hands and read the first sentence on the page aloud in his own voice. His voice was hoarse and faltered slightly on the final word, but every word was clear. Josie raised one hand and covered her mouth. On the bed, Emmett opened his eyes. Wade continued with the 2nd sentence, then the 3rd, reading slowly while one finger followed each line. No one spoke. No one interrupted him. The 3 of them remained in that room for a very long time, with only the voice of an 11-year-old child reading aloud and the sound of the water outside the harbor, striking the wooden pilings, and no one wanted that night to end. The story of Josephine Calloway and Emmett Rourke ends there, and if anything remains with us, perhaps it is this. What heals a human being has never been money or power. It is knowing that when we close our eyes, someone is still sitting beside us, and the kindness we offer during the darkest night of our lives always finds its way back to us. It simply returns later than we expect. There are silences in life that we believe we will have to endure alone forever, until the day someone is willing to sit beside us and speak. Sometimes that alone is enough to diminish the darkness by half. If this story touched your heart, please give this video a like and share it with someone you believe also needs to hear it tonight. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that every day we can listen together to more meaningful stories. How did the story of Josie and Emmett make you feel? What moved you most? And what lesson did you take from it for your own life? We sincerely hope to read the thoughts and feelings from deep within your heart in the comments below. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very last moment. We wish you and your loved ones abundant health and a life filled with happiness and peace each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.